A newborn wolf pup lay pressed against his mother's frozen body, the cord still tying him to death in the snow. An old forester carried him through the blizzard, but the tiny heartbeat kept slipping fainter, slower, until it nearly stopped. It felt like the ending was unavoidable. And then inside the warm cabin, the impossible happened. The old cat, nature's sworn enemy of the wolf, didn't raise his claws. He climbed onto the table, curled beside the freezing pup, and with a rough sandpaper tongue coaxed life back into that trembling little body. What began as tragedy became the first page of an unforgettable friendship. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from, and if you believe love can defeat even death, hit subscribe and join our family, because this is the kind of miracle you'll never forget. Snow came sideways over Duluth's frozen harbor, turning the lake into a sheet of iron and the streetlights into pale moons, as if winter itself had decided to patrol the docks. Ryan Mercer moved through that white roar with the practiced economy of a man who'd learned long ago that panic wastes oxygen. He was 35, built lean and hard in a way that didn't come from gyms, so much as from years of carrying weight that mattered. His face was all angles, cheekbones sharp beneath wind-burned skin, a squared jaw shadowed by a short, rough beard he never quite bothered to tame. His hair, dark brown with the faintest pepper at the temples, stayed clipped close, as if the world might grab it if it got the chance. The most noticeable thing about him, though, was the stillness behind his eyes, a calm that looked like confidence, until someone got close enough to see it, was also a kind of guarded distance, the way a shoreline stays beautiful precisely because it refuses the sea. People on the street usually read him as unfriendly. The truth was simpler and sadder. Ryan was careful with warmth, the way a man is careful with matches during a blizzard. He'd been a Navy SEAL, and even though he was out now, the job had left him with habits that didn't clock out, scanning doorways, measuring footsteps, listening for what wasn't there. What had truly changed him wasn't the firefights or the training. It was the quiet afterward, the messages that didn't come, the phone calls that did, and a loss that arrived like a sudden blackout. Since then, he'd been living alone in a small apartment overlooking the industrial edge of the harbor, telling himself he preferred the solitude, as if preference and survival were the same thing. That evening he hadn't gone out for heroics. He'd only meant to walk until the storm tired itself out, to let the cold pin his thoughts down where they couldn't swarm him. But the harbor had its own language, and in the middle of the wind's screaming hymn, Ryan caught a sound that didn't belong, a thin, rasping whine, faint as a spark trying to live in wet wood. He stopped, listened again. The sound came from near the old pier, where the ice piled in ridges like broken teeth. A lesser man might have told himself it was nothing, metal settling, rope snapping, the storm playing tricks. Ryan had never been granted that luxury. He followed the sound, boots biting through drifted, snow-gloved hand lifted to shield his face. Then he saw it, a shape hunched low against the pier's support beams, almost swallowed by shadow and blowing snow. At first it looked like a heap of discarded tarp. Then the heap shivered. A dog raised its head, slow, as if movement itself required permission, and two amber-brown eyes caught the light and held it with exhausted stubbornness. It was a German shepherd, young but already big-boned, perhaps 10 months to a year old, with the classic black saddle marking over a coat that should have been rich tan, but was dulled by grime and salt-stained slush. One ear stood halfway, the other folded, giving the dog a permanently uncertain, almost boyish look, like a soldier who'd put his helmet on wrong and never had time to fix it. Its muzzle was dusted with ice whiskers, stiff, and there was a raw pink chafe line around its neck where a collar or rope had rubbed too long. The dog tried to stand and failed, hind legs skidding on the ice. It didn't bark at Ryan. It didn't growl. It simply watched him, chest heaving, the whites of its eyes showing for a flash when the wind slammed a new wave of snow across the pier. That flash, pure fear, quick and honest, hit Ryan like a memory he hadn't invited. Somewhere under the dog's front paws lay a thin metal tag, half buried in snow. Ryan crouched, the cold biting through his jeans, and brushed it free. The tag was scratched almost blank, but one word survived like an oath that refused erasure. Ranger. Ryan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile and not quite a grimace. Ranger, he muttered, voice nearly stolen by the wind. That's a big name for a kid left out here. The dog's nose flared at the sound, and for a second its tail gave a tiny involuntary flick, more reflex than trust, like a candle guttering but not going out. Ryan held still, letting the dog study him. The shepherd's gaze was intelligent, tired, and wary, the look of a creature that had learned humans could be both shelter and storm. Ryan knew that look. He'd worn it himself. He reached slowly into his coat, not for a weapon, but for the knit cap he'd stuffed in his pocket. He slid it across the ice toward the dog. The dog sniffed, then pressed its nose to the wool, and inhaled as if the scent of another living being was food. Ryan's throat tightened in a way he hated. Emotion was inconvenient, like fog on a scope. "All right," he said softly, as if speaking to a skittish recruit. "We're not doing this the hard way." He unzipped his heavy parka, dark navy, salt-speckled, built for lake wind, and eased it open like a tent. When he moved closer, the dog flinched, but didn't bolt. It couldn't. Ryan slid one arm under Ranger's chest and the other beneath its hindquarters, careful, steady lifting with the controlled gentleness he'd used on wounded men. The shepherd was shockingly light under all that fur. Too light for its frame, and cold enough that Ryan felt the chill through his gloves. Ranger gave a small, broken sound, half protest, half relief, and then surrendered, head-dropping against Ryan's chest. Ryan closed his parka around the dog, trapping whatever heat his body could spare, and turned back toward the streetlights. The storm shoved at him like a bully, and he leaned into it without speaking, because there are moments when words are just decorations. Under the roar of wind, Ryan felt a faint, uneven thump against his ribs. Ranger's heart still arguing with the night. And somewhere deep inside, the man who believed he'd run out of second chances, something equally small and stubborn thumped back. Ryan Mercer didn't run. He simply moved with the unglamorous urgency of a man who knew drama was a luxury the cold could not afford. One arm locked around the German shepherd's ribs, while his parka stayed cinched like a makeshift womb, trapping what little heat his body could spare. By the time he reached the parking lot, his eyelashes carried tiny crystals, and his cheeks burned as if the wind had slapped him for daring to care. Ranger's weight was wrong, too light for the size of the dog's shoulders, too hollow beneath the thick coat, and Ryan hated how familiar that wrongness felt, the way a body can be present while the life inside it wavers like a weak radio signal. The UAZ-like toughness of the old harbor neighborhood gave way to quieter streets. Duluth's late-night lamps looked hazy through blowing snow, like blurred halos someone smeared with a mitten. He got the dog into his truck with the kind of careful efficiency he used to reserve for injured teammates, then cranked the heater until the vents coughed hot air that smelled faintly of dust and old pine freshener. Ranger shuddered once, then tried to push up paws, scrabbling on the floor mat in a confused panic instinct, screaming that warmth could be a trap. "Easy." Ryan murmured, his voice low and level, the same tone that had coaxed fear out of men who'd swallowed it until it turned poisonous. He slid his knit cap beneath the dog's muzzle like a pillow, and kept one gloved hand resting on Ranger's chest, not petting, not demanding, just being there like a steady lighthouse in a storm that wanted everything to be lost. His apartment building sat a few blocks from the water, a brick rectangle that looked like it had survived a century by refusing to complain. Inside the lobby, the air was warmer but smelled of wet boots and old radiators, and Ryan's footsteps sounded too loud in the late-hour quiet. He carried Ranger up the stairs because the elevator was slow and because something in him didn't trust machines when a living thing was fading. On the third floor, a door across the hall cracked open. A woman's face appeared pale in the hallway light, eyes sharp with the caution of someone who'd learned cities have teeth. Her name was Sarah Collins, early 30s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair pulled into a quick, practical bun that made her look perpetually in a hurry. Her skin was fair with a few freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, and she wore an oversized navy cardigan over leggings, the unofficial uniform of people who pretend they're not worried. Sarah wasn't nosy by nature. She was watchful, the kind of neighbor who could be kind without being careless, shaped by a past. She didn't advertise an older brother who'd vanished into addiction years ago, leaving her with a permanent habit of scanning for trouble before it stepped fully into the room. "Ryan," she whispered, voice soft but alert. Her gaze dropped to the bundle in his arms. "Is that a dog?" Ryan paused, shifting Ranger so the dog's head stayed protected from drafts. "Found him at the pier," he said. "Half frozen." Sarah's expression pinched, then softened the way ice melts around a warm stone. "Do you need anything?" she asked, already stepping into the hall. Ryan almost said no out of reflex. He'd built his solitude like a fort, but Ranger's ribs rose in a shallow, uneven rhythm that didn't care about pride. "Towels," he admitted. "And if you've got a hot water bottle." Sarah nodded once, brisk, decisive. 2 minutes, she said, and vanished back into her apartment like a guardian spirit who didn't require an invitation to do the right thing. Ryan unlocked his door and entered a place that looked orderly in the way lonely places often do. Clean counters, shoes lined up, a single framed photograph turned face down on a shelf as if it were too heavy to keep looking at. He laid Ranger on a folded blanket near the radiator, keeping the dog's head elevated the way he'd been taught, then stripped off his gloves and felt the dog's neck. The raw ring of chafed skin made his jaw tighten. Whoever had tied that collar hadn't just abandoned Ranger, they'd been careless with suffering. Ryan ran warm water into a bowl and used a washcloth to wipe salt and slush from Ranger's coat in small, patient circles, watching for flinches, for signs of pain, for anything that would tell him whether the dog would fight or fold. Ranger's eyes stayed open, tracking him with exhausted suspicion, but the dog didn't snap. Instead, it let out a thin, irritated huff that sounded almost offended by kindness, like, "Don't think this makes us friends." Ryan's mouth twitched despite himself. "Yeah," he muttered. "I get it." He found a syringe in his emergency kit left over from a life where emergency had been a daily adjective, and drew warm water mixed with a pinch of sugar, then slid it gently to the side of Ranger's mouth. The dog coughed once, then swallowed, tongue flicking out in a hesitant, confused taste. A minute later, Sarah returned, arms full towels, a hot water bottle, and a can of chicken broth, as if she'd decided hope should come with seasoning. "I didn't know what dogs drink," she said, cheeks pink from the cold. "So I brought options." Ryan glanced at her, then at the broth, and for a beat the corner of his guarded heart loosened. "Thanks," he said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. Sarah's gaze lingered on Ranger's tag, now cleaned enough to read. "Ranger," she murmured. "That's a good name." "He didn't get the life that matches it," Ryan replied, sliding the hot water bottle beneath the blanket so warmth could rise without burning. Sarah crouched carefully, keeping her hands to herself, respectful of both dog and man. "He will," she said, not as a sweet reassurance, but as a stubborn prediction. When she stood, she hesitated at the door, then added, "If you need a ride to an emergency vet, knock. I'm awake most nights anyway." After she left, Ryan sat on the floor beside the blanket, back against the sofa, boots still on, because part of him didn't know how to relax. Ranger's breathing slowly deepened. The shivering eased from violent tremors to smaller quakes, like a storm retreating in stages. At one point, the dog tried to reposition and bumped its nose against Ryan's old slipper, then either out of hunger, confusion, or pure spite, clamped down with a weak but determined bite. The slipper squeaked. Ryan stared at it, then at the dog's half-lidded eyes, and a quiet laugh escaped him, brief and disbelieving, like the first crack in a glacier. Ranger released the slipper, settled again, and for the first time since Ryan had lifted him from the pier, the dog's eyelids drifted closed, as if the warmth had finally convinced his body that sleep wasn't surrender. Ryan stayed there, one hand resting near Ranger's shoulder, not claiming ownership, not making promises aloud, just guarding the thin thread of life through the night, because sometimes the first step back to being human is simply choosing not to walk away. Morning didn't arrive like a blessing. It arrived like a thin truce gray light leaking through frost-webbed windows and showing Ryan Mercer exactly how little sleep could do when worry had been chewing all night. He was still on the floor when he opened his eyes, back stiff against the sofa boots on one hand near Ranger's shoulder, as if his palm alone could keep a heart from drifting away. Ranger's breathing had improved deeper than the night before, but it carried a faint hitch, a stubborn unevenness that made Ryan's own chest tighten in sympathy. The German shepherd lay curled on the blanket by the radiator ears, slack paws twitching in small dream jerks, and when he shifted the movement was careful and guarded like pain lived under his ribs and he knew it. Ryan reached in to check the dog's gums the way he'd checked men in the field watching color-moisture signs of shock, and what he saw made his stomach drop. Ranger's gums were pale, and his belly looked slightly swollen tighter than it should have been for a dog that skinny. The dog whined once thin and irritated, then tried to stand and wobbled like a newborn deer. Ryan had seen this kind of fragile imbalance before, and the memory hit him with a cruel clarity. Not battlefield memories, but the quiet ones afterward, the kind that arrived on ordinary mornings and demanded payment. He swallowed the impulse to pretend it would resolve on its own. Pride was for people who didn't have a life depending on their next decision. He grabbed his keys, wrapped Ranger in a towel and blanket like a bundled secret, and carried him down to the truck. The drive to the emergency veterinary clinic was short, but the sky made it feel longer, heavy with lake-effect snow and low clouds that pressed down on the city like a lid. Ryan kept one hand on Ranger's chest while he drove, feeling the dog's heartbeat, a wary drummer still trying to remember the rhythm of living. The clinic sat in a strip of buildings near a plowed intersection, its sign glowing green against the storm, like a promise someone had dared to make. Inside, warmth and antiseptic hit them together. A few people sat hunched with their own small catastrophes. Cats in carriers, a trembling terrier, a woman wiping tears with a sleeve. Ryan's shoulders tightened automatically. Crowds still made his senses sharpen, and he hated that he was always half ready for trouble in places meant for healing. A technician led them through a door, and that was when Ryan met Dr. Lauren Hayes. She was in her late 30s, medium height, with an athletic, grounded build, the kind of posture that suggested long hours on her feet, and a spine that didn't bend easily. Her hair was dark and wavy, pulled into a loose ponytail that had already escaped into flyaways, and her skin was warm brown, freckled lightly across her cheeks, as if the Minnesota winter had tried and failed to erase summer from her face. Lauren's eyes were a steady hazel calm, assessing unromantic in the best way, and her voice carried the crisp confidence of someone who could deliver hard news without cruelty. She approached Ranger without rushing, letting the dog smell her gloved hand. First, then she murmured, "Hey," handsome, as if speaking to a patient rather than an animal, as if respect was part of the medicine. Ranger didn't snap. He watched her with tired suspicion, then allowed her fingers to palpate his abdomen. Lauren's brow tightened the moment she pressed gently along the belly. "He's bloated," she said, tone measured, "and he's underweight. Hypothermia can slow the gut, and if he's been starving or eating garbage, we could be looking at a GI problem. Maybe gas, maybe something worse." Ryan heard the word worse and felt the old reflex rise, the itch to control what couldn't be controlled. "What do we do?" he asked too fast. Lauren's gaze flicked to him, taking in the set of his jaw, the way his hands were careful but rigid, the stillness that screamed restraint. First, she said, we keep him warm and hydrated the right way. No big meals, small amounts often. Second, we assess temperature, hydration, gums pain. I want an X-ray to rule out obstruction, and I want to check his stool if he produces any. Third, she added softer, we slow down. Dogs feel panic. So do their people. The last word landed like a quiet arrow. People. Ryan hadn't realized he'd been claimed by that category in her mind. A tech brought forms, and Ryan filled them out with the stiff handwriting of someone who'd signed too many documents in his life and trusted none of them. Name, the tech asked. Ryan glanced at the tag he'd cleaned. "Ranger," he said. owner? The tech asked. Ryan's pen hovered. His throat tightened. Not yet, he managed, and the tech nodded without judgment, as if the world allowed in-between states. While Ranger was taken for imaging, Lauren returned to speak with Ryan. She explained dehydration in plain language, warned against milk or rich food, suggested a bland diet, later boiled chicken and rice in tiny portions once the gut was moving, and demonstrated how to check gum color and capillary refill time. She also asked one question that didn't belong on any form. Why did you pick him up? Ryan stared at the floor tiles. The honest answer was too big and too raw. So he chose the smaller truth. He was going to die, he said. Lauren nodded like she'd heard that sentence from soldiers before, even if they were talking about themselves. The X-ray didn't show a clear obstruction, which was good, but it didn't erase the concern. He's not out of the woods, Lauren said. He needs monitoring today. If he worsens vomiting, collapse, more distension, you come back immediately. Ryan felt the word immediately lodge in his ribs like a command. He carried Ranger back to the truck, and when he stepped outside, snow hit his face again, as if the storm wanted to remind him it was still in charge. Back at the apartment, Sarah was in the hallway, cardigan wrapped tight, a mug of coffee steaming in her hands. She took one look at Ryan's expression and didn't ask for details, only said, "I can sit with him if you need to sleep." Ryan almost refused. Then Ranger let out a small hoarse whimper, and the sound cracked something in Ryan's stubbornness. "Maybe later," he said quietly. Inside, he set Ranger on the blanket, warmed a small bowl of water, and administered a few careful sips with the syringe as instructed. Ranger swallowed, then rested his head against Ryan's wrist. Not affection exactly, more like surrendering to gravity. Ryan sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of the dog's ribs, realizing the war wasn't just in Ranger's belly. It was in Ryan's chest, too, a battle between old grief that demanded isolation and a new inconvenient hope that had teeth and amber eyes and refused to let him pretend he was alone. By evening, the storm had softened into a steady, spiteful flurry, as if winter had grown tired of shouting and decided to whisper its threats instead. Ryan Mercer's apartment was warmer than it had been in months, not because the radiator worked harder, but because there was a living body near it that forced the air to matter. Ranger lay on the blanket with his head turned sideways, eyelids, heavy breaths, deeper than they'd been that morning, though still cautious, like his lungs didn't fully trust comfort yet. Ryan had followed Dr. Lauren Hayes' instructions with almost religious discipline. Tiny sips of warm water, careful monitoring, no rich food, no sudden movement, and the kind of quiet that made room for healing. Sarah Collins had texted twice from across the hall, short practical messages that sounded like she'd practiced being helpful without being intrusive. "Need anything? I'm awake." When Ryan didn't answer right away, she didn't push. That was her particular kindness, leaving doors open without forcing anyone through them. Ryan's phone buzzed again, and he finally replied with two words he rarely used, without grit in his teeth. "Still. Okay. Thanks." The evening settled into a fragile routine. Ryan cleaned the kitchen counter, not because it needed cleaning, but because his hands needed a task that wasn't trembling. He refilled the hot water bottle, checked Ranger's gums, pressed fingers lightly along the dog's belly. The swelling had eased, but hadn't disappeared. Ranger responded with a low, displeased grunt that sounded like a small protest against being examined. Yeah, Ryan muttered, almost amused. "I'd complain too." Ranger's tail gave a minimal thump, the kind that could be mistaken for a muscle spasm if you weren't looking for hope. Around 9, Sarah knocked. She stood in the hallway holding a small paper bag, cheeks pink from the cold sandy blonde hair now falling out of its bun in wisps that softened her sharp watchfulness into something more human. "I brought plain rice and boiled chicken," she said. "I Googled. Don't laugh. I know you SEAL guys think Google is cheating." The joke landed lightly like a snowball tossed without malice, and Ryan huffed a quiet, reluctant breath that could almost qualify as laughter. "Lauren said later," he replied. "But thanks." Sarah's gaze flicked to Ranger, then to the framed photo on Ryan's shelf, still face down. She didn't comment. Instead, she nodded once, decisive as always. "If you change your mind about me sitting with him, knock twice," she said, and left him with the bag, and a silence that felt a little less lonely for having been shared. Ranger slept, and Ryan tried to do what he'd been unable to do for months, rest without bracing for impact. He showered quickly, the hot water stinging his wind-burned skin, and when he returned to the living room, the dog was awake, watching him with an expression that wasn't fear anymore so much as calculation. Ranger's ears lifted, one still half-flopped, stubbornly imperfect, and his nose worked the air. Hunger was waking up in him, and with hunger came curiosity, and with curiosity came trouble wearing a cute face. Ryan sat on the floor beside the blanket and held out his open palm, letting Ranger smell him. The dog leaned forward, sniffed, then pressed his nose against Ryan's hand with the cautious gravity of a treaty being signed. Ryan's chest tightened, not with panic this time, but with a strange tenderness he didn't quite know where to put. "All right," he whispered. "We're good." Then Ranger's gaze shifted past Ryan toward the bedroom door, which Ryan had left slightly ajar without thinking. Ranger's head tilted, ears angling toward the gap, as if the darkness inside the room had called his name. "No," Ryan said softly, instinctively, the way you warn a toddler away from a staircase. He rose to close the door, but Ranger chose that moment to stand, wobble once, then stumble forward with sudden determination. For a dog that had nearly frozen to death, he moved with surprising stealth, nails clicking faintly on the hardwood like a tiny thief with big ambitions. Ryan followed, not running but not relaxed either. The bedroom was small and plain, neatly made bed, a dresser, a chair with a folded hoodie. Under the bed, tucked deep into shadow, sat a wooden box reinforced with metal corners. Ryan had built that box himself years ago. Hand steady back then, heart less brittle. It held things he couldn't throw away and couldn't bear to see too often: a dog tag from a friend, a folded flag, and a letter that smelled faintly of lavender even after all this time. Before Ryan could reach the bed, Ranger lowered his head and started pawing at the floor, sniffing with an intensity that made his whole body vibrate. The dog's nose found the edge of the box as if guided by fate's cruel sense of humor. Ranger hooked a claw, scraped, and the box slid out with a soft, accusing rasp. Ryan froze. His throat tightened. He took one step forward. Ranger, delighted by this new toy, nosed the lid. It wasn't locked. It had never been locked because Ryan hadn't needed a lock. He'd lived alone, guarding his ghosts like sacred property. The lid creaked open. Ranger's muzzle dipped inside. For a brief, absurd second, Ryan thought the dog would pull out the flag and parade it like a proud wolf with stolen prey. Instead, Ranger found the letter. The paper's scent, old ink and lavender, hit the dog's senses like a promise of something edible, something important. He clenched it gently at first, then pulled. The letter slid out, edges catching on the metal corner, tearing with a sound that was too small to be called a disaster, and too loud to be called anything else. Ryan's vision narrowed. Heat flashed behind his eyes. His heart slammed, not like a man in danger, but like a man losing the last thread tying him to a life that had once been soft. "Ranger," he said, voice sharp, and the dog startled, backing up with the letter still in his mouth, confusion darting through his amber eyes. Ryan reached out too fast. Ranger flinched. The paper tore again. Something inside Ryan, old grief dressed in armor, reared up and swung without thinking. His hand lifted, palm open, not to strike the dog, but to snatch the letter like a drowning man grabbing air. Ranger's ears flattened. He let out a high, frightened yelp and dropped to his belly, sliding backward toward the corner tail, tucked hard. The sight of that surrender, pure, terrified, instinctive, punched through Ryan's rage like a blade through cloth. He stopped mid-motion, hands suspended in the air, and saw himself from the outside, a big scarred man looming over a half-starved dog, eyes burning grief in his fists. Ryan's arm lowered slowly. The letter lay on the floor in torn pieces, lavender and ink and memory scattered like snowdrifts. Ranger trembled in the corner watching Ryan as if waiting for the storm to hit. Ryan sank to his knees. His breath came ragged. "No," he whispered to himself more than to the dog. He gathered the pieces of the letter with shaking fingers, not reading the words he couldn't, but feeling the paper like skin. Tears rose hot and humiliating. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. He turned his head toward Ranger, who didn't move, eyes wide and wet. Ryan didn't approach. He simply sat on the floor, making himself smaller, speaking softly as if words could mend what hands had almost broken. "I'm the problem," he told the dog, "not you." Ranger's trembling eased by a fraction, but he stayed back, wary and hurt. Ryan remained where he was, breathing slowly, refusing to chase, refusing to command, understanding that forgiveness, like spring in Minnesota, couldn't be forced. It had to be invited and earned and waited for. The night after the torn letter, the apartment held a new kind of silence, alive, uneasy, and honest, like a room that had finally stopped lying to itself. Ryan Mercer slept in short fragments, waking to check Ranger's breathing, then waking again, because the old reflexes in his bones still believed pain was something that could ambush you in the dark. Before dawn, he found himself on the bedroom floor with a roll of clear tape, hands steadier than they'd been the night before, carefully aligning torn paper edges the way a medic aligns skin, not to erase the wound, but to help it close. The lavender scent that clung to the letter didn't stab him this time. It hovered like a memory that had decided to be gentle for once. When the first gray light seeped through the window, Ryan lifted the repaired letter and set it in the box again, but he didn't shove the box back under the bed. Instead, he placed it on the top shelf of the closet, not hidden, just put away, as if he were learning that grief could live in the house without owning the whole place. In the living room, Ranger remained in his corner behind the armchair, curled tight ears, pinned amber eyes, tracking Ryan with the wary stare of a creature deciding whether the storm had truly passed. Ryan sat on the floor several feet away and didn't reach. He simply breathed slow and spoke softly, voice stripped of command. "I won't do that again," he told the dog. "Not ever." Ranger's ears twitched at the sound. He didn't come closer, but he didn't retreat either. It was a beginning, the smallest possible coin of trust still warm from being minted. By mid-morning, Ranger's belly was noticeably less distended. He drank water in small sips without gagging, and when Ryan offered a spoonful of bland chicken and rice mush, cooled thin, exactly as Dr. Lauren Hayes had instructed, the dog hesitated, then ate with slow, cautious determination, as if every bite required permission from his body. Ryan watched the swallow, the way the throat worked the steadying breath afterward, and felt his own pulse slow in response. He texted Lauren an update, brief and factual like a field report. She replied quickly, "Good. Keep portions tiny. Watch stool. Call if vomiting or lethargy worsens." Her steadiness felt like a hand on the shoulder, firm, without being intrusive. Around noon, Sarah Collins knocked. She looked like she'd slept even less than Ryan, tall and slim in a long coat. Sandy blonde hair down today, falling straight to her shoulders, like she'd given up on pretending life could be neatly pinned. Her freckles stood out against skin made pale by winter light. She held a small paper bag again, and this time a leash in the other hand. "I went to the store," she said, voice careful, eyes flicking to Ranger's hiding spot. "If you're keeping him, you'll need this. And don't worry. I told the cashier it was for my imaginary dog, so she wouldn't start asking questions." The humor was gentle, a little ridiculous, and it did what humor does when it's kind. It lowered the temperature in the room without denying the cold existed. Ryan took the leash. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Sarah didn't step closer to Ranger. She simply crouched, set the bag on the floor, and spoke toward the dog in a calm, ordinary tone, like Ranger was already a neighbor rather than a problem. "Hey, Ranger," she said. "I'm Sarah. I live over there. I'm not planning to steal your guy. I'm just supporting the local redemption arc." Ranger's head lifted an inch. His nose worked the air. His tail didn't wag, but it also didn't clamp tighter. Ryan felt a strange pressure behind his eyes, something like gratitude, something like relief. Later, when Sarah had gone back across the hall, Ryan clipped the new leash to Ranger's collar. actually to the temporary harness he'd bought at the clinic's recommendation, because Ranger's neck still showed that raw chafe line. Ranger stiffened at the touch muscles, hard as wire, and Ryan paused, waiting until the dog's breathing eased. "We're not going far," he promised. "Just outside. Just to prove the world isn't only fear." The hallway smelled of laundry detergent and old carpet. The stairs echoed with their careful steps. Outside the air bit, but the sun had the faintest strength to it, a pale coin held up in a sky of thin clouds. The sidewalk was salted, the snowbanks high. Ranger froze at the threshold, chest rising fast, eyes scanning the brightness as if it were too big, too loud. Ryan didn't pull. He stood beside Ranger and let the leash remain slack, letting choice be the first lesson. A few seconds passed. Then Ranger stepped forward, one paw at a time, tentative but stubborn, as if he were walking out of the underworld and expecting the gods to change their minds. Halfway down the block, a city maintenance truck rumbled by and its engine backfired sharp sudden. Ranger flinched, body coiling, and Ryan's own nerves sparked in sympathy. The old Ryan would have tightened, commanded forced control. Instead, he lowered himself to a crouch, turned his body sideways to appear smaller, and spoke softly. "Hey," he said. "Look at me." Ranger's eyes snapped to his face. Ryan took a slow breath and let it show. "We're safe." Ranger trembled once, then steadied, leaning just slightly toward Ryan's knee, like a compass needle finding north. They rounded the corner and reached a small patch of park near the harbor, a place where frozen grass poked through snow in stubborn tufts. A man in a Coast Guard beanie was tossing a ball for a shaggy mutt, and an older couple walked arm in arm, laughing about something private and sweet. Life continued unbothered by grief's demands. Ryan felt something inside him loosen, not all at once, but enough to let air in. Ranger sniffed the cold ground, then, as if remembering he was still a young dog with a ridiculous sense of timing, he trotted toward a snowbank and buried his muzzle in it, emerging with his face dusted white. He sneezed an exaggerated theatrical sneeze, then looked back at Ryan with an expression that was almost offended, like winter had played a prank on him personally. Ryan stared at the snow-smeared shepherd, and a laugh rose up, real this time, fuller and warmer, the kind that surprised him by existing. Ranger's tail wagged once, then twice, then found a rhythm, thumping like a small drum calling in a brighter future. Ryan's phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "How's the redemption arc?" Ryan looked at Ranger, then typed back. "Still in progress." "But," he wagged. And I laughed. He slipped the phone away and kept walking, man and dog, leaving paired tracks in the snow. The harbor wind still howled and the past still existed, but it no longer owned the whole horizon. Hope, it turned out, didn't arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrived with a leash, a sneeze, and a dog brave enough to take one more step into the light. Sometimes a miracle doesn't look like lightning in the sky. It looks like one more breath in a cold room, one more wag of a tail. When fear says run, one more softening of a heart, that thought it was done. Maybe God doesn't always part the sea in front of us. Maybe He places a small shaking life in our path and asks quietly, "Will you choose love anyway?" And when we do, when we stop, when we help, when we forgive, He turns an ordinary day into holy ground. If you're watching this right now in the middle of your own storms, work, stress, loneliness, grief, anxiety, remember this: God is still writing, even when the page looks torn. A broken moment can become a doorway, and what feels like an ending can be the start of a new kind of family. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below where you're watching from and tell us, have you ever experienced a small miracle that changed your life? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you stories that warm the heart and remind us that love still wins. May God bless you and your family, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide you through every storm. Amen.